Hello, welcome everyone. This is New Hampshire Peace Action's Peace and Justice Conversation Series. If you are new to New Hampshire Peace Action, we educate, mobilize, and organize to build a more peaceful and just future for all. We envisage a future where international relations are based on cooperation instead of competition and conflict, and where mutual benefit and shared security lead to a more peaceful and just global community. The corona pandemic spurred us to start this bi-weekly conversation series as a way to continue our public education work. And we found it so effective that we've decided to continue it on indefinitely. Every other Monday, you can join us here to help engage and sort out how we're going to make the changes that we've been yearning for and working for, some of us for many decades, as our speaker will attest tonight. In the spirit of understanding and respect, we want to take a moment to acknowledge that we're doing our work here in New Hampshire on the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. We want to honor with gratitude the land and waterways that they have been stewarding throughout the generations that have been stolen from them by Europeans. So tonight, we are very excited to bring Doug Bogen, who was one of my first annual event speakers a few years back. He's been an environmental organizer and an advocate for almost 4 decades. He's focused on grassroots action and citizen-led advocacy efforts to challenge the biggest environmental issues that have faced us. He's currently the director of the Seacoast Anti-Pollution League in Exeter, which is focused on being the watchdog organization for the Seabrook nuclear power plant. He also is promoting renewable power alternatives and cleanup of the Superfund toxic waste sites at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyards through SAPL. He serves on the statewide steering committee of 350 New Hampshire, which is a special project of New Hampshire Peace Action and an affiliate of the international climate group 350.org. And he's the founding member of Seacoast Peace Response. You may know Doug from his more than a decade of work with Clean Water Action's New Hampshire program, where he, for a good portion of that, was the state's program director. He's worked combating climate disruption. He's worked on toxic contamination, mercury and military wastes. He's protected drinking water. He's worked to clean up the state's fossil fuel plants and the coastal water supply. He lives in Barrington, and he's been a resident of New Hampshire Seacoast region for 3 decades. He got his master's from Cornell in environmental education and in science and environmental education. He's going to talk to us tonight about the energy revolution that has begun off the shores of New Hampshire. Offshore wind has the potential for providing most of our future electric power needs, especially in New England, if we can keep moving forward to build the necessary infrastructure. Doug's going to talk to us about some of the recent developments for our region and discuss the many benefits of offshore wind when we are striving for a clean and sustainable energy future. He's also going to touch upon opportunities that offshore development provides for military facility conversion, which is obviously something that's very important to us here at New Hampshire Peace Action. So, Doug, we're so glad that you're able to join us tonight. Thank you for your time. Take it away.
Okay, thanks a lot, Will. That's a great introduction. Good evening, everybody. A lot of you know me, but some may not. I'm going to be talking about an issue that's near and dear to my heart, and something that I have presented previously, as Will mentioned. It was about a decade ago now. So hopefully there'll be some new things for the folks that have already seen my previous presentations, and some new developments, of course, that are happening. If you're following environmental developments, I'm sure you've been hearing something about offshore wind in recent years and even recent weeks. But I hope to get everybody up to speed on what's going on. So I think we can go right to the slides. Screen share going. Now the slideshow is not wanting to work. It was working just a minute ago. Maybe we'll just have to go with it like that. Maybe that'll do it. So hope everybody can see that all right. Some of the slides might be cut off a little bit depending on how your windows are set up. But as Will mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the revolution that's really taking place off our shores. This is something that's been building for some years, but certainly in the last, really just the last 2 or 3 years, it's become much more of a big thing, and I think becoming more real for people. I wanted to start by just, reminding us all of what's at stake here. I'm sure most everybody on this Zoom is familiar with some of the issues facing us, like climate disruption, air pollution, the impacts and limits of fossil fuels, and our inefficient power plants, some of which are 50, 60 years old, and obsolete power grid that is continually being challenged, and the overall catastrophe, either of a climate catastrophe or nuclear catastrophe. Pictured on the slide are 2 of our largest power plants, of course, the Seabrook nuclear plant and the Bow power plant, Merrimack Station in Bow, which burns coal, which fortunately is not burning very much these days, but it is still open for business, and they're getting paid not to burn coal these days, but on standby. And I also mentioned Seabrook because that's really—
Doug, I don't think we're seeing the slide you want us to see.
Are you seeing?
We're seeing the first one.
Yeah. Oh, you're not seeing why offshore wind? All right. Maybe
Try clicking in on the slide and then hitting F5.
Actually, I think it might be worth Doug stopping share and trying again.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think
Yeah.
what I did is got onto 2 different images, perhaps.
Doug, maybe start sharing before you, start the program before you start sharing.
Let's see if this works. Okay, is that moving forward?
There we go.
Yeah.
Sorry about that, folks. I haven't done this much. I mean, I've been on lots of Zooms, but I haven't presented much on Zooms. But hopefully that'll be the worst of our glitches. So anyway, I was talking about the Seabrook plant, and really the reason I got interested in offshore wind was that we were looking for an alternative to Seabrook and our other power plants around the region. And this was about 12 years ago, and the Seabrook plant was up for relicensing, and the agency dealing with it, the NRC, was not entertaining alternatives. And we ended up actually suing them over the idea that they should be considering alternatives, notably offshore wind. And there was certainly a lot in the wind, pun intended, with offshore at that time. But we couldn't point to a specific program that was already up and running, so they kind of ignored us. But it definitely got my attention to work more on this issue. And I want to put offshore wind in the broader context of renewables development. Obviously, we have solar energy and biomass energy and other types of renewable resources to tap into. And offshore wind is just one of them. But the fact is they do complement really well. When the wind isn't blowing, the sun is often shining, and vice versa. Offshore wind in particular is very good in matching what solar gives us, in that it's often windy at night in the wintertime, and that leads to better balance of power. I also want to say that, the broader goal, of course, for the world really is to get to 100% renewables. The science tells us that we need to get there by 2050, if not sooner. And many environmentalists think we should be getting there in the next decade, if possible. And offshore wind can be a big piece of this puzzle. This graphic was put together by a group called the Solutions Project. You can see their website at the bottom. And they have projected what a 100% renewables picture could look like for each state and for almost every country in the world. And it's not that this is the way it has to be done, but the point is it could be done just using solar and wind resources. No new technology, just what we have available. And they project that it will save us money and create jobs and be good all around. Unfortunately, most people still haven't heard this news and they're still confused. We also have to point out that we do need a expanded, smarter grid. The New England grid is quite a few decades old. It's definitely in need of upgrades, but power lines certainly are a hot topic or a topic of derision at this point. But much can be done with linking up existing sources better, as well as offshore sources. Power lines can be put offshore. In fact, it's a much better way to convey power for a number of different reasons. And we could be linking up new sources or new ways to store energy, in particular with electricity. We need to be able to have it when we need it. And there are, of course, new battery technologies being developed, including automobiles that can be used as storage batteries and batteries in people's homes. So with a much more diverse and decentralized grid, we can get much better access to these renewable sources when we need them. I also mentioned that the solution has been addressed in the past. This was a report about 12 years ago now, which again got me really interested in offshore wind. The state of Maine started exploring this back in the mid 2000s, and they put out this report December 2009. And the news that came out was that there was enough offshore resource in Maine waters to replace 150 nuclear plants. So that really got my attention. You could imagine we only have 100 nuclear plants in the country. So it would be really awesome to be able to tap into that. And the state of Maine actually enacted a law that sets a goal of 5,000 megawatts of offshore wind. That's about double what the state uses currently. And that would provide enough for the whole state and perhaps neighbors. So it's a huge opportunity. And Maine is, with a few ups and downs, has continued to pursue it. This is a chart shows kind of how they would get there with offshore wind at 5 gigawatts, 5,000 megawatts, land-based wind at 3 gigawatts. You put them together and you convert all of the buildings and residences to heat pumps, electric heating, convert all the transportation to electric vehicles. And they predict that they could still have power left over to send to other states like New Hampshire, which of course is behind. So it's a great vision. It's going to take a lot to get there, but they are getting there. Now, there was also a national report put out right around the same time that projected that there was up to 40,000 megawatts of offshore wind available off the Northeast coast, and about 2,000 megawatts just off of New Hampshire's coast. We'll see a little more specifically about that in a minute. But nationwide, as you probably have heard, the administration has set a goal of 30,000 megawatts, 30 gigawatts by 2030. That's very ambitious, but there are already about 27,000 megawatts currently proposed off the East Coast. So, and in various stages of development. So we're getting close to being able to achieve that figure. And with a little extra, kick, we should be able to get there. And that report is still available. There's several different related reports at the Department of Energy relating to this. Europe, as you probably know, is way ahead of us on offshore wind, up to a decade, really. And they have tremendous resources, 25,000 megawatts from over 100 farms. They're projecting another 85,000 by 2030. And the United Kingdom is actually leading, I think, in Europe with aiming for 30,000 megawatts by 2030. So there's just a huge potential out there, and Europe is showing us the way. And the good news is that we can learn from what they're doing in Europe. And that is happening with some joint agreements, as I'll describe later. Now, just to give a broad picture of where the offshore wind resource is, you can see, and this is color coded, the brighter red and blue, purple is the higher wind resource. You can see that off the coast, there's more wind potential than almost anywhere in the continental US, excepting a little spot out in the middle of Wyoming. For some reason, they have huge wind out there, but it's pretty limited. And of course, most of the people live on the coast. They don't live in Wyoming. They only have one congressional seat out there, less population than New Hampshire. And much of the upper Midwest is considered the Mideast of the US. And states like Iowa are leading the country in wind resource development. But again, they're a long way from where most people are. So the real advantage is to the Northeast and the Northwest, where we can tap into this resource only 10, 20, 30 miles offshore. Now, moving in a little closer to our shores, this is the coast of Maine from Eastport down to Kittery. You can see tremendous potential. The orange and the red is where the highest resource is. It's basically an average of over 20 miles an hour wind speed at the height where the turbines would be. And it's very close to shore, so you don't have to go too far out to get that wind. And moving down the coast to Little New Hampshire, yes, we have a very short coastline, only 18 miles or so. And it's even narrower as you go out into the ocean due to the way they've lined up the state boundaries as you go offshore. So we don't have as much resource, obviously. But even with this narrow pie slice of ocean real estate, it's estimated that we could generate up to 2,000 megawatts. That's more than the Seabrook nuclear plant, off on the right there and on the left. And there is potential. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that when you get more than 3 miles offshore, it's all federal waters anyway. The US government regulates it, not the state of New Hampshire, the state of Maine. And we will be able to tap into waters off of Maine or off of Massachusetts. And that's being done by other states, as we'll see in a minute. So just to round out the picture, off of Massachusetts, it's a huge resource. They have about 200,000 megawatts ideal potential on both the north and south shores. And just on the north shore, it's a good amount, again, very close to New Hampshire. Now, going offshore, as you go further offshore, the wind gets stronger, as those maps show, but it also becomes more challenging because you're going into deeper waters. Most of the waters off New Hampshire and Maine and northern Mass are deeper than what you can put a piling down to reach the ground under the ocean. So they're talking about floating turbines, and we are developing the technology to do that. Another point is when you get further offshore, the visual impact of the wind turbines is much minimized. As you get 10 to 15, 20 miles out, you're basically going over the curvature of the earth, and they sink into the horizon as ships do when they sail off, as Columbus figured out 500 years ago. So that's a real advantage. And with, again, floating systems, you can go 25, even 50 miles out and be out of sight and not bother the local residents as we've seen previously. Another advantage with offshore is you can build floating turbines in a dry dock at the shore, at a dock in the harbor, and then float them out to where you want them. And that's a big advantage because you don't have to worry about what storms are coming by and the ocean conditions and being out on the ocean as much. So that really helps. So we have several floating turbine systems already up and running. Going from left to right is the Highwind system that's actually a Norwegian outfit, but it was installed in northern Scotland, again, off the UK. And it was originally going to be sited off of mid-coast Maine, but as you may recall, we had a governor in Maine who wasn't real keen on offshore, and particularly wasn't keen on foreigners coming in and building wind farms. So they ran them out of town, pretty much literally, and they built it in Scotland. And there's 5 turbines there, about 30 megawatts. And these, again, are floating, even though it looks like a single piling, it's actually a floating buoy type system, a spar. The advantage in Norway, of course, is they can build them in the fjords where they have very deep areas under the water to be able to float them. The one in the middle is off of Portugal. It's actually an outfit out of the US, Principal Power. And I believe they have a system with 5 or 6 turbines. And then the third one is off in Japan, off of Fukushima, which of course got my interest. It turns out that wind turbines were about the only thing that kept running after the Fukushima tsunami and meltdown of the nuke plant. So Japan is really getting revved up to do more offshore wind. Now, back in 2013, the University of Maine floated the first offshore wind turbine off the US. It was just a 1/8 scale prototype, and they floated it out in the Penobscot Bay. And it didn't generate a lot of power, but it demonstrated the technology that they're using there, which is very innovative. I won't go into it all now, but it was quite a good test, and they were able to withstand the equivalent of a 500-year storm with the system they have. And of course, you probably heard about the Block Island wind farm. This was started up in 2016, the first offshore wind farm in the US. These are not floating systems, they are on pylons, but they are generating, again, about 30 megawatts of power for Block Island and the mainland. So coming up, the next step at the Gulf of Maine is to build a full-scale turbine, 10 to 12 megawatts. They're planning to build this and float it off of Monhegan Island in the next couple of years. It was supposed to have been up and running by now, actually several years ago. But again, you might have heard the governor of Maine was being difficult, and they didn't allow for it. They actually rescinded the PUC approval for the system, and they still get flack from the fishermen, even though they sought the best location they could for this turbine. Now, the next step in Maine is they're planning to do a research array. This sidesteps a lot of the commercial issues with a wind farm, but it does allow for greater research into the impacts of offshore wind. And again, it would be a floating system. It's a consortium of the University of Maine, Aquaventus program, and a couple of big corporations you might have heard of, Mitsubishi, and another one called RWE out of Germany. It'll be almost 30 miles offshore. So again, pretty much out of sight. They're hoping to get it up and running in the next 5 years or so. And they did just apply for the permits from the Department of Energy because, again, it's far offshore. Just to give you an idea, it's off of mid-coast Maine. The city of Portland is off to the left, the very far left of that map, and then it's kind of just south of Booth Bay and Monhegan Island as well. And of course, there will be a power line either running to Wiscasset, where Maine Yankee used to be, or to the Portland area. It's not determined yet how that'll work, but it will be generating 144 megawatts of power when it's up and running. Now, another important point is that wind turbines are getting bigger and bigger every year. It's been tremendous just in the 10 years or so I've been following the issue. They've pretty much tripled in size and tripled in power production. The bigger the turbine, the more power you get. So the newer ones are getting up to 10 to even 15 megawatts of power for each turbine. That's enough to run a small city or a large town. And the largest one that's been built as a prototype now is a General Electric, a US turbine that's about as tall as the Eiffel Tower, as you can see on that diagram. And it supersedes one that's in the inset photo there, which is built by Vestas, which was, I think, about 9.5, 10 megawatts. Every year they keep coming up with new designs and much more efficient systems. You, of course, also get economy of scale by doing the larger turbines, and they have less impact on wildlife as well because they move slower. Now, as I mentioned before, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, federal agency in the Department of Interior, runs everything offshore, more than 3 miles offshore, and they have a process for leasing sites, and we'll be looking at some of the sites that they have already leased for offshore wind. There's about 15 different projects up and down the East Coast, excuse me, from North South Carolina all the way up to Massachusetts. The ones you probably have heard some about are off of Massachusetts, just south of Martha's Vineyard. We'll look at a closer map of them in a minute. But it's really a tremendous set of projects that they have going, and it adds up to, as I said, something like 27,000 megawatts overall. And another thing you notice about the map is that there aren't any lease sites north of Cape Cod, anywhere in the Gulf of Maine, excepting again that University of Maine project, which is actually in state waters. So Bogen doesn't have anything to do with it. So that's the new frontier, and Bogen is already committed to siting a lease area sometime in the next few years off of our coast. So that is coming. Now, this is the sites south of Martha's Vineyard, 15 to 25, 30 miles offshore. And they will be running cables to the mainland, either Cape Cod or Rhode Island. And as I mentioned, neighboring states are tapping into waters off of Massachusetts. Rhode Island, Connecticut, and even New York is planning to set up a system. It's actually just got approved by the Bogen. That's going to be sending power over to the Hamptons in Long Island, if you know the area. They were willing to be one of the first guinea pigs to tap into this resource. So that should be up and running in a few years. And then you have a half dozen other projects, thousands and thousands of megawatts. Massachusetts is already committed to, I think, 5,000 or 6,000 megawatts. Connecticut, Rhode Island, they're all tapping into this. And of course, New York State has huge plans, most of which, of course, are closer to New York City than this. But it's a huge area. It's actually the size of about the square acres of Rhode Island that's being developed. But there's more to come for sure. Another important point is that the cost of this power is coming way down. This chart is already a bit dated, but you can see the Block Island wind farm was relatively expensive. It was still cheaper, it turns out, than the power they were getting on the island at the time. So it was to their advantage. But you can see the cost has been brought down by 2/3, really, and even more so. The latest, the lease that was the financing package for the Vineyard Wind project, the first one off of Martha's Vineyard, came out at like 6 to 7 cents a kilowatt hour. So it's going to be much more cost effective. They expect it'll save $1.5 billion for ratepayers in Massachusetts. So it's really getting to be very lucrative. And you can see in Europe, they've also come out at very low prices. They're actually thinking that they won't need to have any subsidies going forward with these inexpensive projects. Another point, of course, is that there are many other economic benefits. We're obviously reducing the need to import expensive fossil fuels. Both Maine and New Hampshire import $5 or $6 billion worth of fossil fuels every year. And of course, it'd bring many thousands of new jobs. And nationally, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of new jobs and tens of billions of dollars in new investments. So this, I think, has really gotten the business community very interested in offshore wind. Another point is that offshore wind or wind development in general, renewables, is much more cost effective in terms of job creation. The chart on the left shows the comparison between renewables in general, wind, solar, and other developments compared to fossil fuels and natural gas. You get many more jobs per dollar invested in those technologies. And then the other chart shows the comparison of clean energy to military spending. In particular, you're getting like 60% more financial impact by investing in clean energy versus military or other government operations. Now, I want to give a little chronology of what's happened in the last decade. We got a legislative study done back in 2014. They did recommend that the state request a intergovernmental task force, which is the first step in developing offshore wind. We frankly thought Governor Hassan at the time would just jump right on this. It didn't cost the state any money. It was just a good thing to get moving. Unfortunately, she was running for US Senate at that time and neglected to move forward on it. Then in January of 2019, we did finally get the new governor, Sununu, to issue this task force request from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. And we were a little surprised that he moved forward, but again, I think he saw the business opportunities as well as politically that it was a good thing to do. Seems like I'm missing a slide here, but we'll see if that comes up. The state, again, also started talking more about offshore wind. One state official quoted as saying offshore wind is going to be a big player. We love this. All of a sudden, it was becoming, good business. And then in December of 2019, we did get the Gulf of Maine Task Force initiated. There were about 200 people that were invited that were official task force members. About 100 of them turned up at the first meeting. And we had even more people from the general public, about 250 participants altogether at the University of New Hampshire. Some of you might recognize the Stratford room there. And that was all great, except that COVID hit, of course, a few months later, and they didn't, I guess, want to go online or didn't schedule another meeting. And we still haven't had another meeting of the task force since then. But I think one will be scheduled early in the new year. So hopefully that will be getting more on track. Now, there's some next steps for New Hampshire. In particular, we need to do what, again, every other Northeast state has already done, which is procure or purchase hundreds of megawatts, if not thousands of megawatts in offshore wind. There was a bill this past year by Senator David Waters of Dover, I'm sure many of you know, SB 151, that actually passed in the state Senate 23-1, which is pretty amazing, the way things go in the state Senate. But then it got stalled in the Finance Committee. They, I think, realized that it wasn't going to fly in the State House, and so they held it there. It's not sure whether that will come back, but we in the non-governmental organization world decided to push a effort to get the governor to act on his own, which he could do, to issue an executive order. And so there's a petition and the letter writing drive to Governor Sununu. You can go to our website, saplnh.org, to find the links to write a letter or sign the petition, hopefully do both. And so I hope some of you will avail yourselves of that. I believe there have already been 150 letters sent in to the governor on this issue, but hopefully there'll be many more. Now, I want to get back to the issue of the military. It's certainly the concern of most people on this call. As you know, I started out talking about this again a dozen years ago, and we saw this huge potential for the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in particular for developing offshore wind. We have, of course, this largesse of Cold War military industry and a real squandering of resources, the economic stagnation that results from that, and of course the climate impacts of all that armaments. And of course, for offshore wind, we need industrial infrastructure. We need the heavy lift capacity, dock space, warehouses, deep water access, which of course the shipyard does provide. One of only a few ports in the Gulf of Maine that could provide that access. Also dry dock facilities. This is a submarine pulling into one of the dry docks at the shipyard. They have 3. They're actually planning to expand this one, I think, further out into the harbor to handle more subs. And we hope that in the future, perhaps some of that could be devoted to something other than weapons of war, weapons of mass destruction. So we have to ask whether the shipyard does play a role in a sustainable transition. It certainly has the right location, the right facilities, and the ability to contribute. And amazingly enough, the U.S. military has actually at least tipped its toe in the water, so to speak, to develop renewable energy. There was actually a project, the last bullet point there refers to there was a proposal to build a prototype wind turbine off of Cape Nettic, actually, about a decade ago again, and send the power over to the shipyard. Unfortunately, the US Navy, in their wisdom, decided it was too expensive and they didn't want to pay the premium that it would cost to do that. But it would have provided all the electricity they needed for the shipyard. Now, they do also have a program for leasing of the facilities on the shipyard to private entities. It's called enhanced use leasing to make better use of the existing resources. And they have done this even at the shipyard. And they attempted to lease out the old prison. If you're familiar with the area, that's a giant castle-like structure at the front of the shipyard. But nobody wanted it, evidently. It's probably just too much trouble to retrofit it. But they had another project for a super duper high-tech hydrofoil type boat. That's the lower picture on the screen that was developed and tested actually in Portsmouth Harbor some years ago. So there is a precedent for this. And there is, I think, some space available. And we've actually heard that the shipyard has offered some space for development, at least at an initial level to the university or so forth. And the US Navy is again, I said, talking about going green. This is a picture of the, I believe, the San Diego Navy Yard, where they do have solar panels. And the DoD is committed to going 25% renewable by 2025. And they have developed biofuels that can run both their ships and airplanes, amazingly enough. So you have some good R&D development there. although of course that's not really what we're looking for. Excuse me, up the head here. Now, we did develop a local coalition of groups, including New Hampshire Peace Action Maine, and several local organizations to push this idea of the shipyard becoming more sustainable, more useful to us. I would mention as well that the latest effort at the state level they set up a commission to look at offshore wind. They did list looking at opportunities for collaboration with the Ports of Naval Shipyard is one of the things that they are looking into. It's on their to-do list. So my sense is that they will be talking with them, getting again, perhaps a foot in the door toward using some of the facilities there for offshore wind. So my broad idea is that we need to move from, you've heard of peak oil to peak wind. And that's the acronym I came up with for a P for peace transition, E for environmental renewal, climate action, E for economic renovation and green jobs, and C for country, energy independence, security, and sustainability. So hopefully something like this will become a watchword in the future. Again, our next steps toward a sustainable future include building a broader coalition, enacting legislation, as I mentioned, to procure offshore wind and require that the renewable standards be expanded, and also to press state and federal officials on leasing and permitting. And speaking of coalitions, there is a new New England coalition for offshore wind. You can see the website there. They have over 80 groups that have joined on. It's very broad-based, academics, businesses, and environmental groups, of course. I don't know if there are any peace groups as yet, but it'd be great if New Hampshire Peace Action wanted to join. So you can go to their website, learn more about it. And it's a real good outfit. Almost all the various enviros, folks are on board with that. And I believe that's my last slide. So I will turn it over to you. We can have some discussion.
Great. So we've had a lot of great questions in the chat as we've gone, and we've got about 15 minutes for Q&A. So I'm gonna read these off. As we're going through the chat, if you have a question, you can put an asterisk in the chat and I will call on you. Or you can just type your questions in and I'll read them aloud. So I'm going to start with Michael Hoey's question, and he says, do the turbines need to be stopped if the wind blows too fast?
I believe so. I'm not, an engineer or anything, but my understanding is that all wind turbines, whether on land or on the ocean, have a upper limit to what they can tolerate. So I believe they do when it gets too windy. Although there has been some research on whether wind turbines would actually help in the case of a high wind storm or hurricane. It would actually reduce some of the energy. You need a lot of them, of course. But my understanding is, yes, they do need to be protected against very high winds.
So Bill Maddox asks, what does the Maine fishing industry think about offshore wind farms?
That's a good question. You've perhaps seen some noise, some criticism in the media, more so down south of us off the vineyard with the Vineyard Wind project. But the fishing industry in general is pretty antagonistic to offshore wind, as we've seen previously, but even more so now that we're looking at actual sites. There's a national outfit called RODO, which they call Responsible Offshore Development Association, which seems like a misnomer to me. But anyway, their spokesperson said that they are mutually incompatible, which is kind of a non-starter because we need to develop offshore wind, and frankly, the fishing industry is dying out because of climate, among other things. But it has been a challenge. I think the state and the industry has done a lot of work to reach out to fishing interests. And even in New Hampshire, they have been included in discussions. They are certainly considered an important stakeholder. And the fact is there should be accommodation. There has been a lot of compromises made south of the Cape, and certainly that will continue. But it is difficult when they don't seem to realize that we need to share the ocean. It's everybody's ocean.
So there's a question and there's a response to the question too. So I'll read them off together. So Carol Weingeist asks, what are the concerns and impacts relating to birds that will be hitting turbines, and what can be done to reduce the hits and deaths of birds? And Ken Wells had a response to that, which I'll read off, and then you can add on, Doug. So he says UNH Cornell have had a wind turbine on Appledore Island off the New Hampshire coast for years. The island is a seagull rookery with 15,000 nests annually. 0 bird strikes.
Yes, that's right. I heard that from the guy who watches the wind turbine out there. It is a smaller one. It certainly isn't like what we're talking about here. But I've been out to Appledore Island and seen the turbine, and they do have a lot of birds. If you've ever been out to Isle of Shoals, you're certainly aware of that. And the fact is they found ways to reduce bird impacts. It turns out just painting one of the blades a different color seems to discourage birds from flying into it. And again, with the larger turbines, these really big ones that we're talking about offshore, they move a lot slower. They're much bigger. They're turning, at a similar revolution, but the blades are actually moving slower. And that gives more opportunity for birds and other wildlife to avoid them. There still needs to be more research. And again, this research array that they're planning in Maine would go a long way toward that, and other work being done elsewhere offshore. But it's certainly not as big a problem as it's either been in the past with onshore turbines or even with existing onshore turbines, again, because of the scale and the dearth of birds. I mean, if you watch birds at all, we know they, like people, they stay close to the shore generally. And when you're talking 20 or more miles offshore, there's less bird life to encounter. And what is out there generally is staying close to the sea level, the ocean, the water level. So it's not anticipated there'll be a lot of impacts, and a lot of efforts have been made to avoid potential impacts with both birds and other sea life.
All right, next from Will Thomas. I think I suspect how New Hampshire's current governor and Republican legislators feel about ocean wind power. Can you comment on New Hampshire's future connecting with this tremendous resource?
Well, as far as the politicians, as I mentioned, there's been growing interest on both sides of the aisle. I mean, we kind of assume the Democrats are always on board, but certainly having Governor Sununu, he even talks about procurement in positive ways, at least the concept. He hasn't agreed to move forward with it, but he's not against it. And that's really new. I mean, talk about revolutions. New Hampshire has never done energy procurement on any level, really. So this is a new thing for the state. But we were quite pleased to see, the state Senate, as I said, voting 23-1 for this procurement. There are a lot of, checks and balances, various measures to make sure that everybody would be on board when they actually did the procurement. But it does seem to be a growing interest. And again, the financial benefits seem to outweigh a lot of the previous criticism. It would certainly help if we had more politicians that understood the gravity of the climate crisis. But, that's some people can't be helped, I guess. But we do anticipate that there'll be a growing majority that will support it.
All right. So another question from Michael Hoey. Isn't the military trying to go more off grid in an attempt to become less vulnerable to cyber attacks? I hadn't heard that. Is that something you've heard about?
No, not specifically. I mean, I don't follow those technical issues so much. I know the nuke plants, interestingly, because they're so old, even Seabrook was basically designed back in the 1970s. They never went online to begin with. So they're actually better protected by not being, so tied in with the internet. So there's certainly some advantages there, but again, that's kind of beyond my expertise.
So Judy Miller would like to know how the energy from wind turbines offshore gets to land.
Yeah, it's relatively straightforward, although I get the question quite a lot. There's a power line and it's buried both under the water and under the seabed, generally. When you're in a silty type environment, they can actually plow down under the seabed and bury it 6 to 8 feet underground. And in other areas where there's ledge, they can create artificial barriers. You obviously don't want bottom trawlers, whatever, fishing folks to be getting caught up on the power lines. They're also heavily insulated. I've actually seen a cut through of what they look like. And I think they actually transfer the power much more efficiently underwater, underground than you do in pylons up in the air. Of course, you got to get the agreement from people at the shoreline, and that's proving to be probably the tougher issue depending on where it's done. But again, there are ways that you can route it so it doesn't affect private individuals at all or much.
Dorothy Courier asks, what's the impact of the sounds of construction and operation on whales and other marine life?
Yeah, that's been a concern. They actually are driving pilings into the seabed, at least in some ways that they do it. I know there's an agreement to avoid the times when sea life, like whales in particular, are migrating through the area, spending time in the offshore areas. So they are cognizant of that. Again, with floating systems, which we look to have in the Gulf of Maine, you don't have that problem because other than installing the mooring lines with anchors, you're not impacting the seabed or doing huge amount of construction. But certainly, all efforts have been and will be made to avoid those sensitive times.
And that does kind of lead into Sarah's question. So I think that you addressed it there. And if I'm wrong, Sarah, I'm sorry to skip forward, but we're almost out of time, and I want to make sure we get to all the questions. So Gray Fitzgerald asks, thanks, Doug, for your tenacity and faithfulness on this issue. One concern, I've read that the turbines only last about 30 years and are not recyclable. Is that accurate?
Well, like everything, including nuke plants, they always set a date, which they're designed to last. And I think they're warranted for 20 or 30 years. They are making them, of course, of new materials, composites in particular, and other materials that are hopefully, expect to be longer lasting. And there will be some maintenance certainly required. Things do break down with any technology. My understanding is, though, that when they construct these wind farms, when they permit them, they have to have a plan for decommissioning, dismantling of them in the end. And that's certainly perhaps an advantage over old technology. But I don't know much more about the recyclability or what's to be done with them in the end. But my understanding is that they have a much better handle on it than we do for like nuclear waste, for example.
So Joel says, my understanding is that fish prosper where there are underwater structures, such as those provided by offshore wind turbines. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's been well known for many decades among, marine scientists. They actually build artificial reefs off of Florida and other places where you can just dump like old cars after you've taken out all the toxic parts or other machinery and of course, weapons of war and other things that we've dumped off of the coast or crashed off the coast. And they do become very good marine habitats. And they've actually seen that with, the Blockwind wind farm, the only one we have up and running. They've actually noticed the development of marine life around the pylons of the wind farm. And you can actually watch a video, I believe, on one of the websites. I'm not sure if it's still up and running, but the company that's running it now, his name is escaping me. They, I think, put together a video about it. And my understanding is they're actually doing tours along with seeing the wind farm, fishing tours, because the fishing is pretty good around that wind farm. So we expect that it will provide something of a marine sanctuary. Again, this research array off of Maine will help prove that, will demonstrate. Even a floating system can serve as a artificial, not a reef, but a platform. If you ever saw the film Kon-Tiki, there's a great visual of all the fish that were hanging out under the floating raft that was going across the Pacific. It's a great film, by the way. But you get the idea that fish will be able to use this as a sanctuary habitat.
Well, unfortunately, we still have some questions in the chat, but we are out of time. Thank you to the participants for giving me a constant stream of questions so that we could keep this conversation lively. It made facilitation very, very easy. So I appreciate that. And most of all, thank you, Doug, for your presentation tonight, for your decades of work for the environment, your at least decade of work on this issue, helping us transition to a sustainable future. Thank you for your time and thoughtfulness in this program. You can stay in touch with us at New Hampshire Peace Action at nhpeaceaction.org. You can check us out on Facebook. Our next conversation in 2 weeks will be on homelessness with Ellen Grow. It'll be on on the I believe it's Monday the 21st. But join us every other Monday. December 3rd, I'm going to talk about what our priorities going into 2022 are. We've got Marcy Winograd coming for a program we're co-sponsoring with 350 New Hampshire on January 12th. Brenda Lett, I think, is still in the works. We're not fully confirmed, but we're hoping to have Brenda around Martin Luther King Day on January 17th. So follow us on the listserv. You should be getting our emails if you've registered for this program. And you can keep track of us with our Friday upcoming events blast. Doug, do you have any final thoughts before we sign off for the night?
Again, I just remind people to please go to our website, saplnh.org, and do the petition, do a letter to the governor. And you can find more information as well, of course, about offshore wind there and the other sites, the New England Coalition. So again, thanks everybody for your interest and your attention. And I look forward to speaking with you again sometime.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks, Doug.
Good night.
Thank you, Doug. Great.